Right, welcome everyone. I hope you're having a good weekend, and really I just want to introduce what we're doing tonight and what this means. This is the first of the Aliens Expanded vidcasts, and they are going to be a series of vidcasts to accompany the production of the documentary Aliens Expanded. I am the writer-director Ian Nathan, and I'm going to be hosting each of these vidcasts, and it's a chance for us to sort of expand the universe of what we're doing, to really get into the granular detail of the franchise as a whole and orientate everything back to Aliens. And as those opening title credits tell you, tonight's subject is the first film. This is entitled The Legacy of Alien, and it's a chance to talk about the first film, Ridley Scott's great triumph, the film that set it all up, the film that began it all, in terms of what did it give to aliens? What did it set up for the future? A future they didn't know yet, but what were the qualities that were imbued by Scott and the whole creative team behind Alien that really would then follow on and give us Aliens. So it's about giving birth to a franchise, if you want, bursting through to give us a franchise. And I have a very special guest tonight. It's Aaron Percival, better known as Corporal Hicks, from Alien vs Predator Galaxy. Or is it AVP Galaxy or Alien vs Predator Galaxy? How do you term it?
I think we're long past the age of the acronyms, so I always go by Alien vs Predator Galaxy. All that search engine optimization kind of rubbish that we have to deal with in this day and age. But yeah, well, thank you very much for the introduction.
No, it's a pleasure to have you here. And before we carry on, why Corporal Hicks? Why? Yeah, I know he's Aliens, but why have you called yourself Corporal Hicks?
As a kid, I say a kid, for me, the time that I became enamoured with Aliens, more accurately to start with, to be honest, Corporal Hicks was was the leading man. He was the cool, not ice cold, smooth as ice kind of character that appealed to me, that preteen, teenage kind of era. As I grew older, I definitely appreciated more that calm, collected nature and having responsibility thrust on his shoulders, shall we say, as I had to deal with that kind of stuff in my adult life. It's also another reason Dallas is one of the characters I identify the most with. But yeah, nowadays that's the kind of thing that I like about Hicks, the calm and collected nature of him under the pressure. So I did consider rebranding, going by my first name, but then I was like, no, I just love Hicks too much. I'm sticking with that as the online moniker.
He's the guy that has to deal with all the griping. So, it shows something about your ability to deal with the pressure yourself. Okay, obviously, I take it that everyone watching tonight has probably seen Alien and knows a fair bit about its background. I'm going to try and do a sort of montage, quick recap of how you get to Alien. As shortly before we came on, Aaron, said, he saw it as a great example of not auteur theory and the opposite. It's a great example of collaborative creation. And that's something maybe we'll talk about as we go along. He sees Aliens as very much a James Cameron film, but actually Alien as a film that came from many different directions. So as far as I can tell, and jump in, Aaron, if I miss anything, the sequence of events is Dan O'Bannon works with John Carpenter on Dark Star, where they're both film students. Dark Star is obviously a film about a stowaway alien on a sort of ramshackle spacecraft.
Among many things.
Many things.
Film is incredibly insane. Go watch it if you've never seen that. That is brilliant humour.
Yeah. And it's funny rather than scary, so it's a different approach to the subject. And maybe there's a little bit of difference of opinion between Dan O'Bannon and John Carpenter about who got credit for the final film, because it is John Carpenter as director. So rather miffed, he went away and started a screenplay called Memory, which was about a crew who heed a call on a foreign planet, and the adventure begins. But he only sort of starts to write it when he gets a call to go and work on Jodorowsky's Dune in Paris, where he is joined by an extraordinary array of people, designers, Chris Foss, Mobius, all these incredible people. And during that period, Dali, who was going to play the Emperor of the Known Universe in Jodorowsky's untenable version of Dune, suggests someone called H.R. Giger to come in and be another designer on Dune. So Dan O'Bannon experiences all these incredibly talented designers and unique voices and thoughts in science fiction. But Dune, of course, he falls apart because Jodorowsky wanted to be 12 hours long and hadn't read the book. And there are all sorts of issues with Dune. But let's come back to America with poor old Dan O'Bannon, who is out of work, basically, and goes to stay on Ron Suchet's sofa, where they carry on working on Memory. And that becomes Star Beast, and the idea of the alien bursting out, coming in. It's originally a spore, but it becomes the facehugger and bursting out of a crew member, and then it's the stowaway on the spaceship. And we have just the basic outline of what we know as Alien, but it's very much a B movie, and it's kind of got this kind of Badazooks kind of quality to it, and all the characters are kind of rather cheesy names. By a series of chance encounters, I think, if I'm right, Aaron, Dan O'Bannon sort of thought it would be a kind of Roger Corman style movie. I think that's what he was aiming for, and really to make money.
They pitched it to him, if I remember rightly. And it was I don't really have the money for this, even kind of thing.
So his ambitions were, although he'd sort of experienced all these people in Paris and probably had a kind of idea of where science fiction could go, in the kind of meantime, it was very much, let's do it as a kind of a lower grade B movie with Roger Corman. But by a kind of series of lucky events, a producer came along who read the screenplay. And I think physically, it is a myth, but I want it to be true, that he knew where Brandywine, the Walter Hill and David Giler production company, was on the Fox lot. And he walked past and there was an open window that day. And he literally threw the screenplay through the window and it lands on Walter Hill's desk. Now, I don't know how true that is and whether Hollywood kind of really works along those lines. But, the script gets into the hands of Walter Hill, who reads it and says, this is the most awful thing I've ever read, but there's one scene that's really good. And that's the chestburster, the kind of creature coming out of the character, as he was named then. I can't remember what his name was, but not Kane to come. And do you remember the original name of the victim?
I feel like it was Standard.
Standard, all right. Well, if anyone out there can tell us, let us know which crew member was it. Aaron's already on the.
I'm already looking.
Tracking it down. No detail will go undelved in this kind of discussion. But anyway, as Aaron goes on and delves, I will carry on the story. And so we get Walter Hill and David Giler working together to turn what is by now a screenplay called Alien, and Dan O'Bannon did call it Alien because he thought now it's at 20th Century Fox, it needs a more grown-up title. And he read and he saw how often the word alien reoccurred in the screenplay, so I thought, let's call it Alien. And whether knowingly or not, as soon as he did that, I think he invested it with almost a theme as well as a purpose and a style. It's a film about the idea of something being alien, not just sort of in the kind of extraterrestrial sense of the word, but it's almost sort of anti-human, something other, and otherness becomes one of its main themes. But what Walter Hill and David Giler do, because they're kind of hard-thinking 70s filmmakers, is they just apply a kind of rawness and a terseness.
That's a good word.
Yeah, to the screenplay. They kind of took all the dialogue and sort of boiled it down, and they turned all the characters into kind of these. What David Giler originally said were the truck drivers in space, and produced a fabulous screenplay for which they never got full credit because there was all sorts of legal things with Dan O'Bannon subsequently. But we won't go into all that. But I think it's important, Aaron, isn't it, to recognise that while Walter Hill and David Giler are often seen as, they have a kind of hero-villain kind of view, across the whole franchise, but they are so pivotal in the Alien screenplay.
Yeah, Aliens is probably the only one where they aren't the evil guys, but the start of Jim's story makes them sound like the uncaring guys. My favourite quote was him saying, and then some other bullshit happened, was how they finished their treatment. But Broussard, by the way, not Standard. Standard was the Dallas analogue. Okay. And
of course, one of the things that Giler and Hill did was they turned two of the characters into females, because it was an all-male crew in Dan O'Bannon's screenplay. And that would then have a knock-on effect of, again, it's one of these mythical things about who decided that Ripley would be a female and the female lead character. And it's usually credited to Alan Ladd, who was the head of Fox, the CEO of Fox at the time, who's the man who greenlit Star Wars as well. There's a tremendous documentary out there actually on Alan Ladd, if you've got the time. And he's got a fascinating character. He was the son of Alan Ladd, who played Shane. So he's got his own story in this. But he just thought, he'd seen the birds and thought, Tippi Hedren attacked by birds. And he saw some kind of relationship between the screenplay of Alien and Hitchcock's The Birds, which I get, actually. I can see that kind of, parallel. And he said, well, let's turn her into a female. Meanwhile, there's been this journey towards tracking down a director, and various names had come up. Walter Hill was going to do it. Dan O'Bannon, threw his hat in the ring, but that was swiftly thrown back out again. I think Hill realised that science fiction wasn't for him. It was too much like hard work. And I think Robert Aldrich was offered it, and the various people were kind of came and went. Peter Yates.
It was one of the interesting things about the 40th anniversary exhibition that they did at the film school in LA. You know, there was all this documents and paperwork relating to the production of Alien, and you had all these alternate cast ideas and director ideas, and there was stuff in there that we'd just never heard of before, and it was absolutely fascinating. And if people haven't seen that, you should go and try and find galleries of all these documents that were on display at the event. You know, it was brilliant, fascinating.
Yeah, you get an idea of like studio thinking, isn't it? Because studios just create lists of, you know, because they're sitting there going, how do we put this project together? And it's like, well, here's a list of reliable guys, and you got people like Walter Hill and David Giler who don't think science fiction, because in this is probably 1977, 1978, science fiction really was Star Wars at that point in time, and
it was the thing that made it serious, wasn't it? That made it mainstream. You know, not this cheesy tinfoil sort of outfits, and Star Wars comes along and makes it serious. Even if it is, even if it is fantasy, sort of wrapped up in sci-fi.
But I think what's interesting is that at this point in time, the studio, even though they had the big hit with Star Wars, they really had no idea how you make science fiction. You know, George Lucas had made sort of Star Wars on his own and just sort of supplied it to the studio. So you've got people like Walter Hill and David Giler, totally non-science fiction guys, who've kind of really sort of cut Dan O'Bannon, the B-movie guy, out of the loop. And they're kind of going, you know, like Robert Aldrich, who's kind of a hard-nosed 70s film director, Peter Yates, who's similar. No one is thinking science fiction except, you know, it's what the screenplay is. This is kind of, you know, the film is almost sort of built, you know, in despite of itself. A lot of people were kind of coming along and they were just sort of going, well, I'll apply this to it. So the way the screenplay was written, it was almost not as a science fiction film. It almost didn't want to be a science fiction film. Something Ridley Scott, who we'll come to in a second, said one of the things he loved and he sort of adhered to in the film was how it resisted the DNA of a monster movie. You know, the whole movie sort of didn't want to be what it is, and that tension sort of gives it a reality.
Especially with him then sort of using Texas Chainsaw Massacre as the sort of template, you know. Yeah, you can say that's a monster movie in some way in terms of Leatherface. Leatherface? Is that? Yeah, that's the right name. Yeah, but it's not really the monster movies they're thinking about here, is it? They're thinking the more cheesy kind of things that would then also try and come along and ape on Alien, you know, things like Inseminoid and Alien 2 on Earth and stuff like that.
Yeah. So via someone called Sandy Lieberson, who was a lovely guy actually, and he ran kind of Fox Europe, and he'd seen Ridley Scott's The Duelists and loved how it married sort of visual elements with narrative to the point where they were kind of one and the same thing. It's like you didn't have a look to a story. The story and the look were you know, together. And that was, of course, what Ridley Scott does. And he got the script to Scott, and Scott, you know, said, you know, he just said, in that kind of very Ridley Scott way, he just sort of broke it down to a kind of pure principles and just went, this thing's got one hell of an engine. He read it in 40 minutes and just went, this thing just moves. And he was, you know, there was kind of, the myth has him jumping straight on a plane to LA to sign for the film. That's not what happened. I think there were 2 months because he was working on another film that sort of fell apart. And there was sort of a bit of dithering at Fox as well. But eventually he called Lieberson up and said, that Alien thing, is anybody doing it? And they went, no, you know, do you want to, you know, go for it? And he said, then it was the next day he was on a 747. And of course, what he said was, as he left the 747, which was pristine when he got on, he looked back across the kind of the cabin, and it was just a state. It was a tip. There were blankets and rubbish. And he just thought, travel isn't pure. It's not like Star Wars. It's not clean. It's kind of looks like this. So it seems to me like he was already getting off the plane and he was starting to make the film in his head.
That definitely seems about right for Scott. You know, once he's signed on, it's going.
It's going. Yeah. So as you said, you know, it was hugely collaborative in terms of already we've got, you know, 4 or 5 voices in terms of the film. And meanwhile, Dan O'Bannon, who's been sort of retained as a visual consultant, but I think kept at arm's length. I think Hill and Giler and O'Bannon did not get on.
Oh, not at all. Not even till after the film was coming out. 'Cause I think as well there was an interview O'Bannon did at some point in one of the the sci-fi nerdy magazines back in the day, where he had no idea Aliens was being made. He didn't think a sequel would ever be made, and it's just because Walter Hill and Giler kept him out of the process entirely. Which is again part of their evil persona, isn't it? Really, because he's one of the grandfathers, well, the originator of the franchise. Without O'Bannon, there's no Alien.
Yeah.
So it's all part of that, whether it's collaborative or group effort, should we say? Can you say it's collaboration if that camp's not getting on with that camp kind of thing? But it was definitely a group work,
right?
Regardless of whether they got on.
We'll come back to that thought about collaboration versus auteur, in a high-minded way we will. But basically, O'Bannon had assembled a team, and he brought Chris Foss and Mobius, and he had brought Giger onto the film, although Giger was kicked off initially by Fox. Dan O'Bannon had him sort of circling the production. So there was a huge... You can
tell that era of artwork as well, because Giger had labelled it O'Bannon's Alien. The artwork that he did for O'Bannon, that's when at what point in the process he was working on things.
Yeah. Okay, let's have a second clip, and we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about what Ridley Scott brought to the film. Can we get the second clip? Dallas in the ducts. And one of the things I love, particularly about the kind of look of that sequence, is the way the doors close like a sphincter. It's like kind of an anus kind of gripping. It's like a joke about the ship itself was terrified. But I think
that scene is just phenomenal. That is easily one of my favourite scenes of the film, and and the franchise as well.
Yeah, and already it's kind of the point. It's clear, I think, when you look at that, is that, as Ridley Scott says, it is a B movie he was making, and that's from the Dan O'Bannon DNA. But it had an A movie engine, and they applied an A movie, if not better, visual texture to, B movie things. It's the captain of the ship going into a corridor and confronting an alien, which is kind of a cliche if you kind of read that on a piece of paper. But when you look at it in terms of what Ridley Scott and the team around him created, it's all A movie quality.
He takes it seriously, and that's the thing. It. What's the saying? You can't polish a turd, but not to say that they are. The script is like that, but if you take what you are doing seriously, you can elevate that material. And O'Bannon's script is B movie. You go back and read it. With names like Standard and Broussard and Hunter and stuff like that. It is cheesy. It does feel like a 70s cheesy sci-fi film. But, when you have Scott coming on, he is such a good visual storyteller and world builder. And the way he treats the material, in taking it seriously and treating it with respect, it elevates it. And then you have these fabulous, tense, heart-pounding scenes like that, where it ends with jazz hands, which in itself is it looks silly in the freeze frame, but that entire sequence, it gets you going, it gets your heart pumping, and that is what Scott brings to it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, and I've written about Scott and I've written about Alien, and the thing with Ridley Scott, and it's only his second feature film, but he'd shot something like 2,000 commercials before that. He was a 33-year-old, I think, at the time. He was already a millionaire, and he knew what a camera did, and he knew how to light. In fact, he knew how to light better than pretty much anyone in the British film business, and arguably Hollywood as well. He had this extraordinary eye that goes all the way back to, being taught by Francis Bacon at art school. And so the legacy of what Scott brings to this B-movie screenplay is extraordinary. And I love the fact that, he talks about what he did for commercials. He called them like 2 minutes of perfection, little stories in which you sell something and you effectively create desire in the watcher, of the commercial. And I think he does the same thing with his films, especially Alien and Blade Runner. He creates the reaction in the audience, and some of it is desire because you're so sort of absorbed by the worlds. But he creates the dread and the eeriness and the uncanniness of outer space and the practicality and the grunge of
The
space.
mundaneness of it as
Yeah,
well. It feels real. It feels like it's so dull to them that it could just be you walking into your place of work. Already jaded to whatever it is you're doing. It
yeah,
is just commonplace to them, and that's one of the elements of the realism of it.
yeah. And this is almost already, although he wouldn't think along these lines, he's world building for a franchise because he's creating an aesthetic. And of course, Giga, which we will talk about in a little bit, contributes very heavily to that as well. But it's interesting, it's been talked about, as I know you agree with this, Aaron, but he talked about the anti-Star Wars, and that even Scott said that. Didn't want to do a fairy tale. I didn't want knights and special magic in the universe. I wanted it, people at work grumbling, with each other, confronting this kind of absolute horror. But I do see a bit of Star Wars in it. Ron Cobb had worked on, he's a designer on Alien, he was also a designer on Star Wars. I do see, this grunginess in Star Wars.
In the cantina kind of stuff, yeah. I suppose when you're looking at the Outer Rim elements of Star Wars, what's the quote, the scum and villainy of it. That I suppose there's very much grunge to Star Wars at that point. I think it's when you get to the newly constructed Death Star that things start to look a bit shiny.
The Empire is very clean. That's true. But yeah, absolutely. And I think Scott, been heavily influenced by Stanley Kubrick and was quite resistant, I think, as a personality to the idea of science fiction, ironically enough. He wasn't like Dan O'Bannon. He was kind of a bit closer to Walter Hill and Geiler, I think, in his sensibility. And between them, they kind of created what I like to think is a 70s science fiction film. And I mean 70s in terms of, the new Hollywood kind of realistic, daring, filmmaking of that era. I think Alien is a 70s science fiction film.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there at all. And even going into some of the 80s aesthetic as well, with it sort of hovering on that border, that we would see Aliens continue as well.
Yeah. Okay, let's have the next clip if we can. Yeah. Okay, well, it's Kane staring. I've got a bit of echo there. Sorry, let me just. Sorry for maybe Aaron can talk while I'm. Got a bit of echo.
Certainly. Well, like I was saying to Ian, actually, that scene was one of the few that I end up still having to look away from for a long time. Jump scare, ultimately, but for some reason, I couldn't cope with that scene for the longest time. With the only other scene being the autopsy from Alien 3. Yeah. I can watch it now. I can watch it without looking away now, but.
Of course, and people who know the making of Alien, the fluttering inside the egg is actually Ridley Scott's hands in marigold rubber gloves. That's how mundane filmmaking can be in the end. But what I chose that clip for was to introduce an incredible subject and one of the most important parts of the whole Alien franchise, which is Hans Rudy Giger and the biomechanics and the choice of him as designer and the fact that O'Bannon sort of showed, briefly say, showed Scott this picture of Necronom 4, and Scott just went, because that's how his brain works, that's it, that's how it is, flew out to Zurich, met this peculiar guy who'd once been recommended by Dali, and brought him on board the film, and, created something that cinema never had before.
And doesn't get a lot of to this day, which is unfortunate. We still got Syl off of him, which is a fantastic design as well. But people are scared to follow in his legacy, I feel, which is a shame. Alien started getting scared of it as well, which again is a shame for the series. But man, that without Giger, I do not believe Alien would be as successful as it was. That aesthetic to the adult. To the warrior, the drone, whatever you want to call it, that version of the Alien, it is unlike anything that had come before. And unfortunately, a lot of unlike a lot of what comes after, what I was saying earlier. But again, this also speaks towards that whole collaborative thing that I was talking about as well with you before we started, because you've also got people like Carlo Rambaldi and Roger Dickens that bring it all together and make the creature as a whole work for Alien.
Yeah, and serendipity and sort of improvisation in the moment, because Scott had realised you couldn't just show the creature or really show any of the alien aspects in full lighting, because it would just reveal the artifice of what was going on.
The car part stuck to it, and
yeah, all the kind of macaroni bits and all the kind of the nonsense of what they put onto it. So you hide it in shadow, and you use design and lighting and atmosphere and dry ice to emphasize or to sort of hide your creature. And that has this kind of knock-on effect of creating an extraordinary atmosphere for the entire film. That our brains and our imagination sort of fill the darkness, we fill the gap.
It's such an effective method of letting you scare yourself with what's in the darkness. And, on the flip side of that, I completely see where it is a really effective tool. But the movie nerd side of it, it's like, yeah, but I want to see the monster. Show me the suit. But no, you cannot argue with how effective of a filmmaking tool it can be. And it works to such great effect within Alien.
Yeah. And it's that thing of, again, it comes back to your collaboration concept, that bringing in Giger, and Giger had his own history as an artist and his own approach as an artist, grants the film a kind of sort of cerebral atmosphere. So all the things that fascinate Giger, his own dreams, the way he paints and why he paints like he does, are imbued into the lifeblood of Alien. Mm-hmm. So, what I love about the original, perhaps even more than any of the subsequent films, is that sense of mystery in it. And the derelict, which doesn't look like a spacecraft, it looks like a sort of dead creature, a sort of bone on this kind of far horizon. Yeah, and then of course Giger did everything in terms of the alien. So he didn't just make the creature and the face hugger and the egg and those things. He also designed the rocks on the planet and the interior of the derelict and all those kind of elements. And it was kind of a unified feel. So if you watch the film again, you look at the kind of silhouettes of the rock in the storm. It looks like there are kind of creatures in the dark somewhere.
It follows a lot of his curvature, that he likes in the artwork. So it does give it like a relationship to what's coming. You might not see it there on the first time that you see it, but you then start to see the shapes and everything, and it works towards it. And it's also another great thing bringing him aboard as an artist with an established style and an established interest, because we get a lot of, the chestburster is related to O'Bannon's Crohn's and stuff like that. So it comes with its own baggage, shall we say, while O'Bannon's writing it. But then you bring somebody like Giger aboard, who has this own fascination with all the sexual imagery, and it all just starts to then coalesce into this deeper subtext that helps elevate the film as well, because it's not just Scott, it's not just O'Bannon. Giger's got his own fascinations that brings into the design, brings into the set design of the derelict and stuff like that, and it's all just layer upon layer of sophistication to this B-level movie. And it just I'm sorry, I will never get over the idea of this Alien being this hugely collaborative, fortuitous film that works on so many levels because of the so many different people and what they bring to it. Yeah.
And I go back to Alien, and one of the great disappointments for me about Prometheus, and we won't get bogged down in the whole Prometheus argument, whole other stuff down that road, was the fact that, for me, what was really important was the idea that they hadn't discovered alien life before. And it felt like that to me. And maybe you can say they had or they hadn't, but one of them is they're directed and they're confronted by alien life for the first time, as I sort of felt it was. And you see this dead, engineer, as he's known, the space jockey as he was called at the time, and your mind immediately goes, there's something ancient and vast out there in the universe, almost impossible to understand. This kind of relic, this ancientness is so powerful.
For me, that is where Alien, it inspires a lot of the visual world building and using that as a style in the rest of the films. But for me, that is where Alien became this is me talking personally here,
Yeah.
because of my own fascinations. That is where Alien became this franchise interest, because Aliens establishes a lot of the stuff that the comics and the books and the games and everything like that would build on with the world that Jim built. But then with Alien, you have this mystery. So when it came to me diving into the expanded universe, there's one particular comic called Apocalypse: The Destroying Angels, where it was all about the space jockey. It was filling in this mystery, this Lovecraftian
Yeah.
horror cosmic background of what Alien had started doing. This 5-10 minute sequence of learning nothing really other than what would forward the plot of the film, but that wonder, that mystery, that horror of what could be out there was then what sent me diving into the comics to find these adventures that would expand on that. And
Yeah.
that is where Alien is the franchise maker to me, is that
Yeah.
desire to go diving into that mystery. And that's where I'm one of the few people that's like, yes, I did ask for that with Prometheus. I didn't ask for Prometheus exactly, but I wanted that kind
Right.
of thing.
Because I thought it's a word in the screenplay. There's a great purity to Alien that perhaps, and Alien certainly capitalizes on it. And this idea that that every sort of alien encounter movie up until Alien was really either, it was E.T. Well, E.T. came afterwards, but they were kind of 50s versions of Take Me to Your Leader, that kind of thing. And suddenly there's this kind of film in which the alien they encounter is like Jaws. It's an amoral part of the universe. It's just a creature with a life cycle, and it's absolutely formidable.
Mm-hmm.
So it just showed us, it showed us the weakness of humankind. It says our place in the universe is, far smaller than we may think. And the theme that rises out of, the second half of the film, and Aliens especially, is survival. It's about, how does one species get the better of another? It's kind of Darwinian, really, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you rise above being foodstuff or breeding material? That is, yeah, that's the surviving nature of the end of Alien. When it's no dialogue, when it's 20 minutes of just Sigourney saying very little, doing very much, is another part of where the film shines.
Yeah, absolutely.
The heartbeat is going.
And lastly, on Giga, just this wonderful capacity to be, a metaphor for anything you want it to be. Once his work is kind of out there on film, suddenly anybody and everybody can read what you like into it. Male rape, disease. Did it foretell AIDS? It's about the invasion of the body. So it's like the creatures invading the ship is a kind of a version of invasion. Dallas and the Ducks. It's kind of everything becomes this kind of elaborate metaphor in the film, which is what great art has in it.
Yeah, it's when you can reflect what it can be such a personal individual reading. It's where things like the critical analysis of the films are interesting, shall we say. Things like the Memory documentary that came out a couple of years ago. I can watch that and be like, I can kind of see where you're reading from, but I don't agree with you, but I can kind of see it. And I enjoy the flexibility of that art in terms of being able to see what people take from it specifically.
Yeah. Well, Ridley Scott, he just get out of it. It's just a B movie, with this kind of good creature, and he won't go into all that kind of the readings of it, even if you poke him. All right, let's have the next clip. Okay, we're back. Of course, that is Sigourney Weaver as Ripley. As Aaron was just joking, it's like the whole franchise, you should just, the basic message of the whole franchise is listen to Ripley. She's always right. I mean, it won't have any films, nothing would happen in them because she would just sort it out.
I feel like Ash would have still found a way, even if they'd listened to her, as he did.
Of course. I think it was the writer David Thompson, who's a terrific writer on film, and he loves the Alien franchise, especially the first two films. And he says it shouldn't be called Alien. The franchise should be called Ripley, because actually the story is Ripley's journey. The thing that glues it all together, certainly if you look at the first four, isn't the creature. The creature is sort of like the MacGuffin. It's the driving force of events. but the storyline is Ripley's reaction to each situation. And in the discovery of Sigourney Weaver, they found someone who would be a star, incredibly charismatic, but also grounded and human and accessible in ways I don't think many stars could be at that time. She was an actress on board the ship.
She's one of those elements that adds to, again, the realism, the way it feels like you are just walking into your own work. Who doesn't know people like Ripley? But with Sigourney's charm, not necessarily charm. With Sigourney, you believe her. You believe in her, and she has this strength of character, of performance, where it's like, yeah, I wouldn't have disobeyed her. I would have listened. She knows the book, and it was the right move to make.
Yeah, Quarantine. I mean, yeah, she's right, and she's hard in the first film. That's one of the great, I say, the 70s qualities of the first film is that none of the characters are exactly likable. Whereas Hicks and Hudson we love pretty much straight away. We're kind of on side. Whereas in the first film you want them to live, but that's more of a kind of human instinct than you like them particularly.
It's a thing I say about the books and the comics as well, is I don't have to like them as long as I find them interesting or believable. Yeah. And you can say that a lot with a lot of aliens as characters overall. We don't know a lot about them. There is not much history or background or anything going off. But in the moment, we get to know them. We get to know the personalities and the conflicts. And again, it all feels real. These feel like real people in this situation. And Ripley's there at the end of it all, the unlikely hero, or unlikely survivor, should we say, who has to bring it home, has to bring it all together. And I struggle to think of, you see it with the other films, the non-mainline alien films, where it just doesn't quite work, but Sigourney makes it work.
Yeah, absolutely. She is great in all the things. All the films, however weak you may think Alien Resurrection is, she's terrific in it.
She is brilliant. Yeah. Ripley 8 is one of the best things about Alien Resurrection.
Yeah. Well, I love the fact that when it came to casting her, it was between her and Meryl Streep they were down to. And I think Meryl Streep didn't want to do it because John Cazale had died. And,
somebody just...
Yeah, and she just wasn't in the right frame of mind. But in a different universe, we could be talking about an Aliens where Meryl Streep is the kind of lead actress.
You can't imagine it, can you?
Yeah, it's a strange thought experiment, really, to have. You picture Meryl Streep, running around with the Marines, and it's a different kind of film. But no, we have to be eternally grateful that the stars were in alignment and Sigourney Weaver sort of came on board. And I think she, certainly from Cameron's point of view, was the only way you could build onward.
Yeah.
In terms of the story.
I mean, they did it. You see, you sort of triggered me a little bit with the whole, Alien is Ripley. And you can argue that, yes, 1, 2, and 3 are Ripley, and 4, for all its faults, Sigourney is brilliant in it. But, there are other explorations to have outside of it. But that's a whole other conversation. But when you think to Aliens, and you look at some of the concepts that they were exploring for Alien 2, a prequel idea about the ship, the derelict ship, or another crew just showing up and repeating the story of Alien, basically, it just doesn't have the same appeal. In, 2020 hindsight, of course, because Aliens is flipping brilliant. So it's hard to argue with that result there. But I totally see that Jim pulled the best idea. She was the standout of that film, and it's not like now where we're kind of like cringing at the idea of bringing her back with cloning or some contrived thing with Blomkamp thing. But at that time, in the 70s, in the 80s, with how great she was in this film, it was the perfect move to just go, I can do something with this character, because it then opens it up to like all the PTSD stuff and all the whistleblowing kind of elements to it, and you had a lot more depth to who Ripley was in the first film. You know, you expand greatly, and yeah, Jim honed in on that perfectly.
I think he understood what I think Ridley Scott understood. That actually, although it's called Alien, it's a story of human beings, and it's because all movies, in a sense, should be stories about human beings. We can argue about Avatar at another time, but it's a human heartbeat to it all, and what we relate to is this kind of idea of survival and kind of human beings under intense pressure. And because you've got an actress as good as Sigourney Weaver, and you've got a character as strong as Ripley, you just kind of, I think it gives you something to hold the film together, or hold the franchise together, I should say.
Yeah.
Should we get the last of our clips up? Okay. That's kind of what you were talking about at the beginning, Aaron, wasn't it? That's about the only time I think we see the warrior alien, the drone. Sorry, I've got a cat trying to invade this kind of vidcast here, a version of Jonesy trying to invade my personal space. But it's the only time you see the alien almost in its full glory, is right at the end on the Narcissus.
Mm-hmm. And just like the even if we don't see it in its full form, and I know like people tend to criticise that moment of it being shot out the airlock, but like the moments like that where you're seeing this slow movement and you're seeing the detail of the glove, and you get to truly admire the work that Giga did there with the design, it's one of the reasons I like those kind of close-ups. Jonesy number 2.
Yeah, sorry.
Fun fact about Jonesy.
Yeah.
And Cameron's initial idea for the aliens, they were going to kill Jonesy, and they were going to replace it with a synthetic cat. What a crime!
There would have been uproar. If that had been the case. I always loved that. I have a pal who I got to know quite well when I wrote the book. He was associate producer on Alien and sort of did a lot of kind of the work behind the scenes. Ivor, yeah, and he tells a story about in the original film when Jonesy hisses at the incredible shot as it sees the alien, and it hisses, and it's kind of one animal confronting another animal, and Ridley Scott sort of exaggerated a little bit when he sort of said it was him down on all fours, sort of glaring at the cat actor, and in fact it was Ivor Powell just got his German Shepherd puppy, and they brought it to set and had it on a leash. This poor cat was going mad. All the rules about animal welfare not being adhered to entirely in 1978, but that's how they got that incredible hiss out of Jonesy. I wonder if we can conclude a little bit on really what you think Cameron saw in the original and what he capitalized on. I mean, because he said the reason why he wanted to do a sequel. And when he'd gone to meet Geiler and Hill, and they said, "Oh, we've got an Alien 2 idea," and as you said, there was like one paragraph written on a sheet of A4, and it said, Ripley and Marines, and Ripley and soldiers go back to the planet, and then some bullshit happens.
He exaggerated a little bit there. I think it was a 10-page document, but with the summary that ended and then some bullshit.
Yeah, I think he confessed it was in the end it was the first 20 minutes, wasn't it, of the film, or the setup that sort of gets them back. In loose terms.
Yeah, in loose terms. I looked at it recently. It's actually quite interesting because a lot of it does sort of form the backbone of Aliens, but then it goes in a completely wildly different direction that is so much better at the end of the day.
But what I think was interesting that Cameron said that he wanted to do it because he was a fanboy. He was a fan of the original. He loved the aesthetic. He loved all the things we've talked about, what Scott brought, what Giga brought, and obviously what Sigourney Weaver brought, but that kind of collaborative atmosphere that the first film has, he absolutely loved. And clearly it had a huge influence on tech noir. If Ridley Scott's aesthetic is called future noir, then see Scott's Cameron's is tech noir, and they are kind of related to one another, and Scott would tell you he completely influenced Cameron. Cameron would say he probably took bits and pieces from Ridley Scott. But it's...
I mean, the first chunk of the movie does look a lot like Aliens. The first chunk of Aliens does look a lot like Alien. There is some visual continuity there in the style, which is interesting. It is it's an attention to detail from Cameron's part of bridging the link, before it then dives off into doing his own thing, and you see more of Cameron's sort of more high octane sort of method of structuring the film, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I suppose if I was to set you an exam question in this strange alternative universe where you can do an A level in the Alien franchise,
Wouldn't that be great?
wouldn't that be great? And I said, what are the similarities between Cameron's approach to the universe and Scott's, and what are the significant differences? Discuss. Yeah.
I think a lot of it tends to be in they both let the set design tell a lot of story as well. There's with Scott, it's this grungy, like we've discussed, this lived in world, and Cameron does the same thing, especially with the colony, and then especially with Gateway as well. That hallway with the trash on the floor, or the mundane workaday kind of feel of it as they pan round the boardroom. I can't remember when I picked up on it, but there's one point where you see, there's one of the guys doing a crossword under the desk, and it's just like, that is so, I'm bored of this. In the same way that Scott's actors are doing this, I'm bored of this. It's not quite the same bitching about Payday, but it is that sort of workaday, I just want to get home kind of feel to the universe, which is, on one hand, it's not really escapism, but on the other hand, it just makes the film feel so, should I say, just feel so authentic,
I love the fact that they smoke. And not that I advocate smoking, but I don't think it dates the films. It has a strange quality of making them feel kind of more real. It looks great on film. Whatever you say about smoking, it does look good on film.
It's all right. They'll cycle back round to it. They'll get rid of vapes eventually, and they'll cycle back round to the authentic cigarettes. But no, you're totally right. You're totally right. Yeah. As well as adding texture to the visuals, it's just, again, part of this realism to it.
Yeah. The idea of mist and smoke and sort of obscurity. But there is a kind of trajectory, isn't there, from what you were saying within Aliens, from the sort of 70s-ness of Scott's original into the 80s-ness of the Cameron dynamic. And it's almost the point where the kind of Marines wake up on the Sulaco, that it sort of starts to change.
Which is, again, is interesting in itself, because, Aliens opens in much the same way Alien does. You have the slow pans over the Narcissus, over the environment, and then you get it again. You get it again in the Sulaco. More so in the special edition, I suppose, than the theatrical cut. But it's that same sort of establishing the location kind of thing to it. But then it goes into an entirely different tone and feel. And, again, a lot of that's to do with the characters, and a lot of that's to do with the war, I suppose, nature of the film. But it does this repeat of kind of moments with completely different results. Yeah. Makes it stand apart. You have this, you introduce Aliens as a continuation of Alien, with the Narcissus moment. You have all the workaday mundane stuff of her life and the hearing. And then you go Cameron, then you go Colonial Marines, but doing it the same sort of structure, and it just sets it off on its own completely different path to obviously Alien.
Yeah. But it's interesting. I saw Alien again on the big screen a few months ago, and what stood out to me, and one of the things I'm interested to explore in the documentary, in Aliens Expanded, is this idea actually that Cameron sort of hits similar notes. The idea of the sequel is present in his mind, that you are following an original film. The point where the chestburster happens, sort of echoes when it happens in the original. He sort of times his film to the similar cadences, doesn't he? They almost the switch to real time at the end with the self-destruct mechanism and the colony's about to blow and all those things.
There's a lot of broad stroke similarities between the narratives. When you do break it down into that sort of very fundamental nature of the story points, I suppose Alien would be respond to a distress call, whereas Aliens is respond to lack of, distress.
Yeah.
And then again you have that fourth act, you have that self-destruct sequence, you have the narrowly escaping the self-destruct sequence, you have the similar timing of when the creatures show up. It's about what, 50 minutes of both films, 50 minutes. So structurally there is a lot of similarities between the two, but you don't complain about it. You don't feel it in that you are just doing the same thing again way, because you're not.
Yeah.
And that's part of the genius of Aliens, I think, is the way that he does this similar stuff to the Alien, to Scott, but then it just doesn't feel it, and it's just its own entirely entertaining alternate path to this similar structure. Yeah, just brilliant.
Yeah. And it's sort of, in a sense, to me, it's like, although it's not the first sequel, we'd had Empire Strikes Back and Godfather Part 2 and all these kind of and series of films back in the history of Hollywood. But in a sense, to my mind, it is kind of the first sequel, because I think Cameron's the first one to sort of think through and develop what a sequel should be in relationship to its previous film. That there's a reason why you're doing a sequel, although it did take 5 or 6 years for them to get it, off the ground. And the reason, so you have to bring forth things from the original and play them, because that's what the audience is coming for. But at the same time, you can't simply do the same thing again. You have to expand it, And it's Cameron's nature to go bigger and better and bolder, because that's who he is. And of course, it was Fincher's nature with Alien 3 to go back to the tenets of the original and the haunted house idea. But I do think one of the things about Aliens, whether he knew it or not at the time, Cameron sort of invented the science fiction sequel. If you take Empire Strikes Back to be a part of a saga, an ongoing storyline.
Yeah, and I feel like Cameron invented. Well, to be fair, you can say this to both of them. Alien and Aliens. They both influenced an entire style of science fiction going forwards. I can see Robin in the comments. I know he's a big fan of Halo, and Aliens is all over Halo. But then you also have things like I've just been playing a new game called Callisto Protocol. Alien is all over that, and they both influence the genre in some fundamental ways that we just cannot escape this far into the future. Both, different routes. Aliens is more militaristic sci-fi. That's why Halo, whereas in Alien is more horror sci-fi. That kind of tense thing. So I forget the point I was trying to make here, but yes, they are both. They are both entirely influential films that we just cannot escape. They touch so much that comes out now. If it's even even minor relationship to science fiction and action, or science fiction and horror. Yeah,
and it comes back to that talent that both Ridley Scott and James Cameron have. That. The Fincher and Jeunet and other directors maybe not have as much of. And that's the ability, world building and creating a kind of environment for this story to sort of, take part in, and crossing the streams, as it were, of design and storytelling, things you've been talking about, that they're almost inseparable with this franchise. That is mapped out. What I adore about both the first films, and maybe it's a kind of a template set down by the first film, is that I take, they're set in the future, and I know that, but they feel like period pieces to me. They feel like you're looking backwards in time from sort of even further in the future than they're set.
Is that not just the haircuts?
The haircuts and the smoking and the battered spaceships and all those things. Harry Dean Stanton always makes things feel like a period piece. But it's a quality. It's like the derelict and the space jockey and all that feels ancient. It's like the universe is old and has all the mysteries in it. They go back far. Forget Star Wars. This is in a galaxy a long time ago, and far far away. That is the mystique. And I think Cameron expertly does something where he throws in all these modern 80s kind of energies and excitements, but mixes them with Scott's sort of mysticism and kind of eeriness. And it's a great you know, it's a great sort of a perfect mix. It's a perfect cocktail for what, you know, the sequel could be.
Yeah, completely agree.
Right. Well, that we've hit 8 o'clock dead on is probably a very good place to finish. Aaron, thank you, because you are just, you know, a fund of great information and stories and thoughts on it. And I know I'm
Well,
going to be
thank you.
talking to you again soon. As I mentioned, this is the first of the vidcasts. We will be doing more. There's going to be lots more Aliens Expanded content. We're going to do some Q&As with some of the cast and involved, so get ready for those. And there'll be regular updates of the production, which is now underway. Very exciting. I'm sure you all read, you know, we interviewed Lance Henriksen a couple of weeks ago, and he was in very good form and told some very interesting stories about, you know, his experiences of making Aliens. So this is just a start, really. So I hope you've enjoyed the discussion this evening. I mean, talk amongst yourselves now for the rest of the evening. I'm sure there's 100 million other points we haven't mentioned that are worth discussing, or disagreements you might have, and that's the whole point of doing these vidcasts.
There's only so much we can touch on in an hour.
In an hour, yeah. So yeah, so I feel like, yeah, we've only really scratched the surface of it all, but that's good because it's a film all about scratch surfaces. So thank you, everybody. It's been a great pleasure. Aaron, thank you again, and I'll see you all soon.